warrior, tribal, and agrarian. Imagine the distant past. This is the harsh reality of the Anglo-Saxon period. The Old English period, interchangeably known as the Anglo-Saxon literary period, was a period of time in England that took place between 450 until about 1066 CE. This period begins from the withdrawal of Rome up until about the Norman conquest of England. This literary period is also the beginning of English as we see it today, creating one of the most confusing and most widespread language in the world. Before England was English, it was actually Roman, and before that it was Celtic. Although conquered by Rome for about 350 years, English never evolved its own Romance language. Some Romance languages we still have today are French and Spanish, although a very large subset is actually derived from Old French, which we'll talk about later. So in 420, for various reasons, the Romans believed that it was time to withdraw from Britain. This left Britain in a vulnerable state, allowing Germanic migrations to displace the native Celtic population and create their own kingdoms. Originally, Germanic tribes came over to England in order to support the Brythonic population that had a lack of military power after the Romans collapsed. But around 450, we start seeing an influx of Germanic migrations. These migrations eventually started the Old English period in about 450 CE. So in 420 CE, these tribes, primarily the Jutes, Angles, Saxons, and Frisians, had a very similar culture to one another, although they were a little bit different from each other. Although slightly different, they put aside their differences and decided to migrate to England in many migrations over the years. These four tribes were Germanic in origin, and they had also practiced Norse paganism. This means that these tribes had a very similar to what Vikings are today, worshipping gods like Thunor and Woden. These gods, although having a different name than Thor and Odin, were in fact the same. After these mass migrations of Germanic tribes, a lot of these tribes started creating their own kingdoms, displacing the native Celtic populations to the north and to the east. We still see the native Brythonic inhabitants of England through countries like Wales and Scotland, but nowadays, England is mostly English and Germanic. In 559 CE, Saint Augustine of Canterbury, a Roman monk, landed in modern-day Kent, England, and started converting the population from Norse paganism into Catholicism. By around the 7th century, all these kingdoms were converted from Norse paganism into Catholicism. Around 700 CE, we start seeing the start of Old English as a culture. This era was defined with many disunified kingdoms and a cultural shift from Old Germanic warrior values to more of a Christian value system we still see today. During this time, there were also a constant fear of Viking invasion, as these Vikings would often raid coastal villages and plunder. It was generally a horrible time to be English in 1066. In 1066, Anglo-Saxon England, there were two contenders for the throne. There was the Norwegian Harald Hardrada, who was also known as the last Viking king, and William the Conqueror, at the time known as the Duke of Normandy. Both of these leaders had a very strong claim to the English throne, so they decided to push it. First was the Norwegian king Harald Hardrada, the last Viking king. He wanted to reunite the North Sea Empire of his predecessors, so he decided to invade England in 1066. He landed in modern-day York, organizing his troops and getting ready for the invasion of England. Unfortunately for the Norwegians, the English were already ready for an invasion. Although they were ready for an invasion, they weren't expecting it to be in the north by the Norwegians. They expected it to be in the south by the Normans. So the English king, Harold Godwinson, not to be confused with Harold Hardrada, decided to march his troops up north and fight the Vikings in the decisive Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066. Fortunately for the English, it was an English victory. They defeated the Vikings and finally kicked them out of their island. But unfortunately for them, in the south, the Normans were already landing. In only about 3 weeks, they had to march from the north of the island all the way to the south. Their troops were tired and did not have much rest. They were not ready for a Norman invasion. With horrid planning, tired troops, and bad morale, it was an English loss. This decisive loss would mark the end of the Old English period, as William the Conqueror, a French duke, was crowned the King of England in 1066 Christmas Day. On the left, we see words of Old English origin. This means that they're Germanic and go all the way back to the Old English period. On the right, these are words from the Old French, which the Normans gave to the English after their defeat in 1066. Norman hegemony essentially made preceding forms of English, such as Modern English, closer to French and non-intelligible to Old English. Nowadays, it's basically a completely different language. For example, I don't think anyone could read this unless you knew a little bit of North Germanic, such as Icelandic, Norwegian, Swedish, or Danish. Even then, you'd probably still have a difficult time understanding this, as it's over 1,000 years at this point. So, this mystery text is actually an excerpt from the Exeter book, which is a collection of Old English riddles written in alliterative verse. So this riddle actually translates to, I heard a ring sing before men, right without a tongue, rightly with strong words. Although it did not yell in a loud voice, the treasure silent before men spoke. Heal me, helper of souls. May men interpret the mystery of the red gold, the incantation. May they wisely entrust their salvation to God, as the ring said. If riddles weren't confusing enough, the added language barrier to this makes it extra confusing. If you don't get it, this riddle is in reference to a chalice. The structure of Old English is a bit confusing to understand, but Britannica explains this as written in a single meter, a four-stress line with a syntactical break or a caesura between the second and third stresses, and with alliteration linking the two halves of the line. If you're like me, and even more confused now, here's an example. Beneath the boughs where whispers sigh, a lonely heart, a mournful cry. Golden sunsets fade to gray, gloomy twilight's dark array. Along with alliterative verse, we also see these things called kennings. I'm sure most of you are unfamiliar with a kenning. A kenning is a type of Old Germanic periphrasis. A periphrasis basically just means you use more words than you need to explain one word. So a kenning is two words to replace one noun or multiple words to replace one noun. For example, swordstorm would be a battle, or whale road would be an ocean. Sometimes it's a synecdoche or a synodoche. I'm not exactly sure how to pronounce it, but an example of this would be the ringed prow for a ship. Although they are over thousands of years old, we still use kennings today. An example would be sleepwalker, mind reader, or a bookworm. These kennings actually indicate an oral tradition, because that means they were said and passed through word before they were ever written down in Old English. Some examples of Old English literature would be the Beowulf manuscript, the Exeter book, which I showed you number 48 of earlier, the Junius manuscript, and the Vercelli book. These are the only surviving poems from the Old English era, which is a bit sad, but we still have clerical texts and records and such, but they aren't quite the same and don't have a large impact on the literary period, so I won't be talking about them. So Beowulf. I'm sure most of you have heard of Beowulf, but it's pretty popular in pop culture. If you're not familiar of what Beowulf is, it's about this dude who goes around killing man-eating monsters. It's a little bit confusing, and it starts at a funeral and ends at a funeral. It's quite sad, I would say. Beowulf is also seen as a commentary on the warrior culture at the time, as they had a very similar culture to the Viking era. Beowulf actually takes place in Scandinavia and a little bit of northern Germany, but it's still an Old English poem. Despite all of this, it was composed in England in the 7th century. Because of this, it's the oldest living example of a Germanic epic that is written down. Then we have the Exeter book. I've already showed you number 48, but it's basically composed of poems in alliterative structure. It was composed between 960 and 990, but we're not exactly sure. Then we have the Junius manuscript. It's biblical and it was written around the 10th century. After that, we have the Vercelli book, which is composed of Old English poems written in Old English structure. It's also written at the end of the 10th century. Now we can talk about other art forms. We can learn a bit about their art through their burial sites, as they were often buried with treasures, jewelry, beautiful handcrafted stonework, and also beautifully intricate metalwork. So, in both the left and in the middle, we have the Sutton Hoo helmet. And in the top left, we have an example of beautiful Anglo-Saxon art that's still surviving today. We also have the Lindisfarne Gospels, which are incredibly beautiful and incredibly detailed Gospels that were hand-drawn in Lindisfarne, England. Beyond that, we also have very important figures. Some important figures include Saint Augustine of Canterbury, who brought Christianity to the English, and we also have Cynewulf and Caedmon, both of these being the two of the 12 surviving names of the poets we still have from around the Old English period. We also have William the Conqueror. Although he's not very important to the Old English period, he's the one who ended it and turned it into more of a French language. Old English still has an impact on today's culture. I can think of Beowulf off the top of my head, but also a majority of modern English is still derived from Old English. Although about 30% of our language is derived from Old Norman French. The English grammatical structure stays pretty similar to what it is today. Also, medieval period England is still heavily romanticized during this time, and Anglo-Saxon England is a part of medieval period England. So what does this mean for our AP exams? This could mean that we see a literary work from the period in our AP exams, but I highly doubt it. These works are incredibly old and have to be translated, but the context is very important in case you get a story from or an excerpt from a novel or a story that takes place in Anglo-Saxon England. I wouldn't really worry about seeing something like Beowulf on your exam. Again, these are super old, so don't worry. Nowadays, a lot of stories are written in the Old English era. Despite this probably not being on the AP exam, I would learn the context of what's happening at the time, like what was going on between the English, Norwegians, and the Normans. And also remember that there are many Vikings during this time. This time was incredibly disunified and recently became Christian, coming from a Norse pagan culture. Hopefully this helped you out a bit in learning about the Old English period and helped you feel confident in your future exam. If you ever feel you're lacking information about the subject, you could always do a bit of research, or you could just rewatch this video. Thank you so much, and good luck on your AP exams.